Welcome to this live ASPI webinar. Thank you all for investing your time to be with us this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're joining from. I'm Fergus Hanson, the Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre here at ASPI, and it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting Marietje Schaake today. Marietje has a CV that makes you feel like you've failed at life. Among some of her roles, she's President of the Cyber Peace Institute and International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Centre. She's also an International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. She's served for a decade as a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, where she focused on trade, foreign affairs and technology policy. Marietje's affiliated with a number of non-profits, including the European Council on Foreign Relations and the Observer Research Foundation in India. And she writes a monthly column in the Financial Times. I'll shortly hand over to Marietje for a few short opening remarks. We're then going to have a brief discussion on some of her recent work and things that she's been thinking through. And then we're going to be opening it up to questions. So please do send through your questions through the Livestorm platform and make sure that you vote up each other's questions or the questions that you like the most. And I'll do my absolute best to get through as many of them as possible. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Marietje, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for those very kind words and good afternoon. It's morning here in Amsterdam. I'm really happy to join you. It's one of the advantages of technologies that we can be in the same room without having to fly literally halfway across the world. But maybe that's also a starting point of where I take my motivation to work on questions around tech, questions around governing technology and which values should inform that, which is that it's so tempting and so easy to look at how technologies that we use every day have made our lives easier, have made it faster and more efficient to move around, to access information, to do our work during a pandemic. But that this comfort and entertainment and ease of use has also perhaps blinded us, certainly as individuals, but unfortunately, I believe also as democratic governments, to the necessary work that needs to be done to avoid that digital disruption disrupts the very foundations of our free and open societies. And I don't think I have to remind Australians of how much pressure there can be on that free and open society. I mean, you find yourselves in a very different part of the world where a big and non-democratic neighbor has a lot of power, and where of questions of power globally, basically wherever we look, technology is an increasingly important aspect. And so in this basically escalating, challenging battle, competition, question of how power can be used to make sure that technology goes in a democratic direction and not disrupts democracy is sort of the field that I find myself in. And I think the moment during which we meet, basically carves out the urgency of this question. We have just had a major revelation around escalation of the use of spyware to target journalists, to target human rights defenders, and even focusing in on heads of state. We have escalations in ransomware attacks. Unfortunately, an ongoing discussion around trustworthiness of information around COVID-19, around the US elections still ongoing. Major questions about supply chain resilience, about who gets to set the standards of technology and by proxy our freedoms and our ability to oversee, our ability to know. So there's a real spectrum, almost like a systems question at hand here. And well, that is what I do. And I think as part of the solution, what is important to achieve is to bridge the gap between those who make the technology, who understand it from a technological angle, and those who govern societies, who are democratic leaders, because I think the gap between democratic leaders and tech leaders tends to be too large, and it's important that both understand each other better. So it's very popular to say, oh, politicians don't understand technology and it's all hopeless. And sure, there's a lot of learning to do, but I challenge you to go to rooms full of engineers and talk to them about constitutions and the rule of law and human rights. There's a lot of learning on that end to do as well. So at Stanford, I have found a place where I think there's a lot of room for these fruitful discussions, a lot of very driven students as well, who feel the responsibility of their role as aspiring tech leaders, but also people who want to make sure that the technology doesn't undermine the very things that they believe in. I'll leave it there as an introduction. I'm really happy to go into more interactive part of this session, and thanks for having me.
Great. Well, thank you for those opening remarks. I think we've got a huge amount we could dive into there. I was going to start you with some questions around politics that straddle your really special experience, both being in the political world and in the tech policy world. And so just a few questions around this. One of the great challenges that we seem to face at the moment is the escalating tension between governments and the tech industry. And you referenced some of this in your remarks. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why we're looking to host the Sydney Dialogue later this year, to try and bring government leaders and the tech industry leaders together to work through some of these issues. But my question is, do you agree, firstly, that this escalating tension is a problem? And how do you see this playing out? Will things become increasingly fractious as governments increase regulation on the tech industry? Or is there an off-ramp where there could be more collaborative solutions? And what could a more collaborative approach potentially look like?
Well, you're right. I do think we're witnessing a sort of reckoning of decades of a very hands-off, laissez-faire, libertarian dominated approach to looking at the technology sector. And I think this is most of all inspired by the US, Silicon Valley culture, and the responses or lack of responses from political leaders. For too long, there's been a almost blind faith that the technologies that were developed, whether they be social media or other kinds of services, would almost automatically lead to more liberties. Remember the era of the Arab uprisings, where the sort of mantra was, if you simply give young people mobile phone and internet access, they will use that to make democracy go viral. And that was, one part of the story at best. I think quite a naive understanding of how hard it is to actually achieve a democratic transition, to build a rule of law in places where it has been systematically stamped out, where people have been repressed, censored, and surveilled. But this hope and also the excitement about the strength of companies, the anticipated benefits, innovations, have really allowed a lot of room for companies to do as they please, to self-regulate, and to, in the process, grow from entrepreneurial startups to monopolistic giants. And I think globally, and this is really fascinating, that across different societies, from China to the United States, Europe, Australia, you actually see governments taking steps to improve and review competition law as it applies to the digital sector, to look at who should decide when free speech bleeds into concerns about public health or public safety, whether it is okay for companies to have intelligence-grade technologies and sell it to whoever wishes to purchase it. What are we going to do about securing our software when we see that either criminal attacks or state-led attacks are exploiting that very sector that used to be the pride and joy of Silicon Valley and the United States? So really the question is, what is the right level of rules of the road, checks and balances, independent oversight? And I think there is simply rebalancing going on between hardly any rules of the road to identifying, what is needed not only within democratic societies, but also in this geopolitical battle between a democratic vision of governance and a more authoritarian one, of which tech is, an increasingly significant layer.
So, I mean, just to sort of contrast the democratic changes and checks and balances that you're talking about with the authoritarian approach, I mean, some of the trends that we've seen in China recently around, constraints being put around some of their big tech companies, the ant listing, for example, and Jack Ma having to go underground. Do you see that as a sort of a different type of dynamic, or is it the same sort of phenomenon but manifesting itself in a different way in the different governance models?
Well, I think it's fair to say that state authorities, even if they represent completely different ideological systems, feel challenged by excessive power without the proper kind of oversight. Now, putting restrictions on a company like Amazon or Google or Facebook in the interest of preserving democracy, making sure that conspiracy theories do not jeopardize public health or harm children or attack the trust in the democratic process, is clearly a different kind of intervention than those coming from typical top-down state-led, in this case, communist leadership. I mean, we cannot equate the context, we cannot equate the effects, but we can see that there's concern about a private sector, some giants within that private sector, and the power that they have amassed and what it does to the role of states as such. And, I'm much more focused on the role of democratic states, because I think democracy is the foundation of our liberties, even if it's not perfect. But democracies offer the ability to constantly improve, to critically assess ourselves, to have those voices, talking between themselves to see what the best path forward is, where I think that authoritarian regimes do not allow for that debate, do not allow for that improvement. In fact, the state is normally constantly preoccupied with retaining its own power. So I don't want to equate it on an ideological level, but I do see it as a global trend. And in that sense, it's also a real question where companies are going to come out, whether they are going to take a values position that is more explicit than it has been. Are companies going to say, we are going to align ourselves with universal human rights, we are going to advance the rule of law, we are going to be transparent about our own governance, for example, we're going to avoid too much top-down governance within our companies? These are all questions that I believe will be much more in the forefront than they have been, where companies and their leaders have said all kinds of beautiful things. Think about the social media giants, about, connecting the world and advancing freedom of expression and so on and so forth. But chances that they have to operate in countries where those freedoms don't exist have not been foregone in the interest of preserving human rights. In fact, the business interests normally drive those decisions. And so the question is whether that kind of value agnostic approach is actually sustainable for companies.
Well, I'd like to just talk about another big trend, and this one's probably a little bit more geopolitical. It's the tech bifurcation that we're starting to see, where many emerging and critical technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, quantum technologies, but also supply chains are fast becoming geopolitical issues. And we've also seen states racing to secure their equities in this contest and picking winners with some large investments, state-led investments. I was wondering how you see tech bifurcation playing out and how the EU's attempt to achieve strategic autonomy plays into this debate.
Well, it's a great question, and actually a fairly hotly debated one. The idea of having strategic autonomy, I think, is a legitimate one. But in the EU, some people are really making the case for more European sovereignty, which I do think puts it in a sort of more radical basket, where, the connotation of the word sovereignty is to really bring a tech sector under under control of the state, to be autonomous in supply chains and production. And of course, that is all, in the case of the EU, not very realistic. And it's also at odds with the ideals of having a system where through trade based on rules, there is mutual dependence, that it's better to trade with each other than to turn our backs towards each other, and possibly worse, to compete in the most cutthroat ways. So strategic autonomy, even the whole idea of sovereignty as a sort of political rallying cry, I can fully understand. When I look at the facts on the ground in the EU, I think there's so much that needs to be done in order to even get close, that it's a space to watch in deeds more than in words. You're muted.
Sorry.
No
Thank
problem.
You. One of the dynamics here seems to be, as well, as of nation states coming in here with these large investments, whether it's to achieve strategic autonomy, or because they see it as so critical to their national interest that they have to be the winners or be the leaders in particular technologies. Are we going to see a reversal, do you think, of the dynamic we saw with the last wave of technology innovation, where essentially the market drove the innovation, the investment, and the product release, to one where we have the state being the principal investor and driving a lot of this innovation, and presumably also dictating, to an extent at least, the terms of its rollout?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of anchor points that we can identify. One, the market, which we've touched upon, indeed has been a very strong driver in the tech sector, allowing the market to sort it out, having very little intervention. And then the sort of trend of today is to look at technological developments more through a national security lens. And where sometimes that is a justified lens, we should not be naive. And I think, sticking to Europe for a moment, there has been quite a bit of naivete about, what was at stake, what is at stake when it comes to certain technologies, who has a keen interest in having them, and what dependencies, either in supply chains or in specific components, chips, natural resources, can lead to. But there's also this big anchor that I don't think we talk about enough, which is the public interest. How can public values be safeguarded if there's, on the one hand, a heavy market-driven development of technology, a national security-driven development of technology? Where does the public factor in it? And I would like to see more focus on how public interests, public values can be safeguarded in the digital world, because the digital world is expanding. It's becoming a layer of everything in our societies, everything touching people's lives. And I would honestly hate to see that layer be inspired in how it's formed by either a heavy reliance on market forces or a heavy reliance on national security forces.
I was going to ask this question later on, but it's a nice segue into the values piece. One of the, if we are going to have this a tech bifurcation, or a competition, or the next wave of technology developed on the basis of democratic values being instilled into the technologies, it seems to me it's not just a matter of baking in those values into the technology products from the outset, but it's also a matter of getting governments to not only preach the values, but to live by them. And I mean that in the sense of when we're adopting new technologies, whether it's convenient tools to conduct policing, or to manage our borders, or to track our citizens in a pandemic. How do we do that in a way that it keeps true to those values? And it seems like that is an area where, at least in in a couple of democracies that I can think of immediately, there's question marks around whether the baking in of those values at the practice level is really happening.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And what is really worrying is how often we see crises like COVID pandemic, but also 9/11, for example, or the war on terror, or now even this systems competition between the US and China, leading to excesses that go against the very principles that we ought to defend against any erosions or direct attacks or things like that. And it is also a testimony to how little has been done to put democratic values first in looking at how governance should be extended, how it should be designed, how it should be innovated to deal with this new digital technological reality. And I think on the one hand, it is important that companies think about the effects that their technologies have from the very design or even before that, to anticipate not only what is hoped for or intended in a good sense, but also what could be the unintended consequences, what abuse could look like. And I think there's been an arrogance, frankly, on the part of democratic societies that their tech sector would be in their advantage. And when the tables turn, that's when the lack of rules or safeguards really actually become clear. Let me give you an example. I've worked for more than a decade now to rein in this private intelligence, spyware, surveillance, hacking market, of which the Pegasus project displayed once again last week the complete abuses of the technology, the mission creep, the proliferation, and the risk that leads to, where we see human rights defenders, journalists, but even heads of state becoming the target of these technologies that are really intelligence grade systems that are now available on the free market. So imagine the mafia having access to this, terrorist groups having access to this, authoritarian states already having access to this. It is a Pandora's box, this whole industry. It is remarkable to me how a number of these spyware companies are based in democratic societies. So you have governments going out there making statements about the need to respect the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, to give people a fair trial, to give a safe space for civil society, and so on and so forth, while the governments to which these statements are directed know that they can sign contracts with companies based in the same democratic societies that are going to provide them the tools and services of choice to repress. And so you really have to ask yourself how to make sure that there are not sectors somehow abused or working exactly as intended, but that undermine the very fabric and the very spirit and the very promise of democratic societies. And so it really worries me to see that from a notion of arrogance that maybe will be in the lead forever, there's been a hesitancy to rein in certain sectors with the aim of preserving core principles, and that one day soon, and maybe this is already happening, but we just don't have a good view of it, our journalists could be spied on with help of, let's imagine, Chinese-made systems. What would we do? What sort of ground do we stand on if we have not put anything in the way of our own industries from exporting and producing these systems, and then suddenly we need to play catch up, and it will look like we're unfairly targeting technology coming from one country without being willing to address our own. So we have to also be careful not to only think about the risks of the use of technology as being a risk when they're in the hands of authoritarian regimes and not being a risk when they're in the hands of democratic governments. It's not that clear cut. And it puts an extra responsibility and urgent task on the shoulders of democratic leaders to make sure that they're taking their responsibility, essentially.
Well, maybe I can follow up on that with two questions. The first one, maybe I can start with a government that we are all, lots of countries, Australia, Europe, the United States is engaging quite actively now as a strategic partner with India. We've got the Quad relationship here in Australia. We've also launched the Australia-India Critical Technology Partner. But we've also seen India in the news recently for a bunch of more controversial reasons, its decision around various internet shutdowns, demands for social media companies to censor content or trace users, which is currently being challenged by the tech companies. So at the same time, we've got the world's largest democracy and a key strategic partner for us. How should we be seeing India, and how should we be engaging India, especially when it comes to sort of issues like the one you've raised?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in more effective and global collaboration between democratic countries. But it also means that there has to be a clear sense of what a democratic rule of law-based society is. And so in those kinds of configurations like the Quad, and you probably have a better view of that than I do, would also be a good opportunity to talk about repressive tendencies, authoritarian tendencies, that we unfortunately see in India. And it may well be that the government of India understands very well how strategic its position is, and is also assuming that they can, get away with these kinds of interventions that go against the promise of what a democratic rule of law-based society is. And so I'm hoping that because there is now an appetite and I think an urgency to collaborate more effectively between democratic societies, particularly when it comes to governing technology, to also really have a frank discussion with those leaders in India to see how they view this, and then to assess whether indeed there is enough common ground when it comes to the foundations and the values upon which to build such a collaboration and to build such a governance model. So pivoting to the point you were making about Pegasus and the NSO group, and your point around needing to do something about this. You've talked about increasing transparency by governments and industry on the use of spyware and these technologies provided by the private sector, as well as greater regulation. How could we achieve that, and can we achieve that as democracies? Well, I'm always looking for opportunities to get things done that I think needs to change. So I'll never say it's not possible. But from experience, I know that this particular question is very difficult for a number of reasons. Indeed, a lot of the technologies that are now proliferating across the world have initially been procured by law enforcement and police in democratic societies under the banner of countering terrorism, which is of course a very important goal, and fighting organized crime, also extremely important. But we lack transparency. In the Netherlands, for example, freedom of information requests by one of our main newspapers have remained unanswered about which tools the Dutch government is using, even though it is known that they're using such tools. And the disclaimer is that they will not purchase from companies that also sell to so-called dubious regimes. Well, good luck with figuring out what that means. And so because there is a lack of transparency, there cannot be a healthy public debate about what is and is not appropriate in terms of the use of these systems, whether they should be used at all, whether they are, for example, used within the confines of the rule of law, and whether the harms are not disproportionate. So even if these systems are procured for legitimate use under rights protecting conditions and so on and so forth, if it ends up proliferating all over the world, if it ends up being used against the same states that have procured it in the first place, if human rights are violated disproportionately, et cetera, then you have to ask yourself, is this mechanism working? And you then have a whole host of tools you could put in place to put more regulations, licensing, oversight over this sector. So, for example, more due diligence, more know your customer requirements, licensing requirements, sanctions in case of operating outside of those legal parameters, export controls. blacklisting for the use by governments if companies have not, stepped in line with those requirements, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is there's very little in the way of these companies right now, a little bit in the EU, where there's just been an update of the dual-use export controls regulation that includes these technologies and foresees in human rights as a criterion to assess against. But from the Pegasus project, we've seen that Viktor Orban has used NSO Group's Pegasus systems and has presumably imported them. And the regulation doesn't stop that. Regulation doesn't talk about use within societies. So I believe that the spyware sector, the surveillance and hacking systems that are in view here are a very good example, even a litmus test for how we deal with some of these ever more quick, cheap, fast, invasive systems within our democratic societies, and what kind of responsibility democratic governments are going to take. And proportionality is a really big question here. Is the use of these systems and the harms that these systems cause proportionate to the alleged benefits, of which we know so little because there's so little transparency?
I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come in from our participants today, but in a moment. But I'll just encourage people to get their questions down, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can shortly. But I just wanted to talk a little bit. I know you've got a book coming out or in the works. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the major themes that you'll be exploring there.
Well, the main theme really builds upon the conversation we're having right now, which is the fact that governments have so much, the fact that companies have so much governing power over everything digital ends up eroding the role of democratic leaders, but at the end of the day, of citizens in a democracy. If we look at how so much knowledge, even awareness of how technologies work, think about artificial intelligence, for example, is also in corporate hands, in proprietary domains. What is the ability of society to even know and understand the effects of these systems? And if we don't know about it, how can we apply better oversight? How can we ask the right questions, et cetera, et cetera? And if ever more data is in private hands, it means that there's power leaking away from the public to the private sphere. And that is, I think, a big trend that we see with digitization. Digitization essentially is privatization. And so questions about what that means for the public interest, for democracy, for the rule of law, not only within societies, but also in the geopolitical context, is what the book is about.
So you've proposed a coalition of democracies to agree on regulations and standards for technology in line with core democratic principles. Can you explain how that might work and some of the issues that they might be able to resolve? And I guess also why democracies might want to band together on this issue when they haven't up to now?
Yeah, so one very worrying trend should inform the urgency, I believe, which is that for the past decade or so, democracy has steadily been in decline globally. While also for the past decade, technology has been, growing as a factor of influence in our daily lives, in society, in our economies, in questions of national security. And so if the unregulated use of technologies is in fact going against democratic values, then it is, and the fact that this is a global phenomenon, a lot of companies are global, a lot of technology travels across borders, is used across borders, then on the one hand, you want to think about how you can also match this border crossing domain, so to say, of operations of different companies with governance. And so to have a global collaboration as a critical mass between democratic societies will really help, on the one hand, and this is attractive for companies, create a more level playing field where it's predictable for companies to which rules they have to adhere and not to have a patchwork of different types of requirements. which will actually hinder doing business. But for democracies to also look at where their interests are aligned, where their values are aligned, where they're under pressure, and to then try to create as large as possible a coalition of governments and citizens and consumers that can be leveraged to achieve those goals. So I think that that's the two main arguments for doing this. And there's not that much time to lose. If you look at multilateral organizations, more often than not, you'll see that democratic societies, even if they strategically cooperate together, democratic states will have a hard time achieving majorities behind their objectives.
I have many more questions on my list, but I want to turn to some of our questions that have come in from our participants. So the first one is from Blair Barker, and he's asked this question. WeChat is used to surveil, influence, mobilise a large Chinese diaspora in Australia. Can we ever realistically expect them to collaborate? What advice would you have for Australian policymakers or regulators?
Well, if the question is that whether WeChat would collaborate, I can imagine not voluntarily, but I would hope that Australian rules and the political system could lead to forcing the adherence to some laws, including respecting fair competition, respecting the data protection requirements that are in place in Australia, making sure that there is some kind of transparency about how this data is being used, etc., etc. So maybe this is the sad conclusion after 10 years of politics, but you can never really make policy on the basis of expectations of the best behavior. You always have to make policies to make sure that also those who are not willing to voluntarily do the right thing, or to, you know, respect fair competition laws, or be transparent proactively, to make sure that you have the means to make sure that all parties do. So it's really about having the right rules in place and the ability to enforce them. And besides focusing on the technology, a lot of the questions around diaspora, minority populations also have a lot to do with making them feel at home in a society, making them less vulnerable to disinformation or to influence from the original homeland, so to say. And we see this globally. If you look at the last US elections, if you look at COVID disinformation, minority populations, minority languages are particularly targeted and exploited to try to sow divisions between people, and to really peel people away from, for example, belief in democracy, belief in science, and the policies to prevent the pandemic from spreading further. So it is really essential, besides the question of what tech companies should do and should not do, to look at how people can be, integrated as part of a society in a way that they don't feel marginalized, which makes them more vulnerable to any kind of exploitation.
So our next question's from somebody calling themselves Uyghur. And the question is, what democracies can do to help the Uyghur diaspora in uplifting their cybersecurity counter-surveillance capability to decrease the likelihood of their family members being targeted or retaliated against?
Well, I think this is a crucial question, and I hope this is not only on the agenda for when minorities in the diaspora are being targeted, but also that there's a more concerted and bold pushback against the repression of the Uyghurs in China. I think it is a systematic human rights violation that needs to be addressed more forcefully. But when it comes to protecting their devices, their safety, obviously there's a role for states there. I hope that the proper state services are looking at what foreign entities are doing to target diaspora and obviously to prevent that. But there's thankfully also a lot of civil society organizations that are standing up for vulnerable populations. So I can think of Access Now, I can think of the Cyber Peace Institute, where I play a role myself, where the whole idea of making sure that vulnerable populations are in focus when it comes to cyber attacks, cyber surveillance, a repression of rights through digital means, wherever that might be used in the world, are all prevented. So I hope that there are civil society organizations in Australia too, or globally, that can help out here too.
Yeah, I think the work of Amnesty International is another one where we've had some really interesting exposés of the Pegasus group, for example, or Pegasus. Our next question is from Hal Folks. It's been, I think, the equal most upvoted question today. And the question is, where do you think the balance lies with governing harmful speech online? For example, extremist groups and calls for violence. Is that the role of the internet service providers, social media platforms, policymakers, or a mixture?
Well, I think it ends up being a mixture. In most European societies, expression is free, but it's not entirely without limits. So, for example, inciting violence, hate speech, in many countries, Holocaust denial are not allowed. And so I think that type of restrictions to protect people, where speech can come into friction with people's safety or non-discrimination principles, are an area to look when it comes to regulation. But of course, we've spoken about how tempting it can be to use threats to actually then undermine civil liberties, when we talked about 9/11 or the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's really important to make sure that measures that are intended for good reasons do not, unintendedly lead to censorship or other kinds of speech restrictions. And in that sense, I think it helps to look at the business models of social media companies, not only as what they like to present themselves as, which is platforms of free expression, but really also look at the data harvesting that goes on, the micro-targeting on the basis of that data that goes on, and the abuse or use of the business model that can really lead to distortion of the information online through the use of bots, through amplification, through the algorithmic recommendation systems, which can lead to non-representative exposure to, let's say, very hostile content, very polarizing content, which can then really play people apart. And so not only looking at the content, but also looking at the methods of spreading information, of data harvesting and micro-targeting, I think leads to clues as to how the most harmful effects of social media type of debates can be reined in. And for all of us to have a better sense of how that really works, we also need more access to information and transparency on the part of companies. It is really astounding. I work at Stanford, how hard it is for my colleagues to actually get access to data to do independent scientific research. Same for journalists, regulators, parliamentarians, civil society actors. How can we have a debate about what is needed in terms of policy to make sure that, for example, our democracy is not threatened, if we don't really know what the problem is? And here it's particularly important because overinflating the risk of disinformation is also harming trust, even if it is not justified. So it is really important to get to the heart of how disinformation spreads. There's a lively debate now in the United States after President Biden spoke out against Facebook for having such harmful effect when it comes to spreading of disinformation around COVID. The same can be seen for platforms like Amazon, where conspiracy theory books are recommended, are pushed to the forefront. And you really have to ask yourself, how many people have seen these recommendations? How come these recommendations surface? Is it because of commercial incentives? Is it because of algorithmic settings? Is it an unintended consequence? We can only answer these questions if we have meaningful access to information, which thus far most companies refuse. by hiding behind trade secret protections and other intellectual property laws, which makes this a very difficult debate and also almost forces us to look at speech because it's the visible part of this question that we can see, and the invisible part is presumably much more influential but much harder to discern and to scrutinize.
Thank you. I've got a question now from Mark Nottingham, and Mark's question is, one of the biggest concerns for human rights advocates, as well as those focused on trade, is internet fragmentation. Are you concerned that government-led internet governance, no matter how well-intentioned, will cause yet more fragmentation?
You know, I'm enormously sympathetic to the dream of an open internet. But I think that that dream is behind us. And we have to ask ourselves who governments are in this context. Government intervention can lead to repression or fragmentation. Government intervention can also lead to the safeguarding of freedom of expression, the safeguarding of freedom of the press, the protection of civil society and human rights defenders. And so I think what is important now is what the goals are of any government intervention. And in that sense, we can really not equate the different actions of respective governments. Some intervene to maximize their own control, to align the regulations of their technologies entirely with state interests, and others are looking for ways to actually preserve the space for freedom of expression and to preserve that openness. But to only focus on the need to keep openness can be, I think, harmful in the sense that if there's not a solid reply to the more authoritarian tendencies that we see in terms of internet governance, then the open internet is continuing to be eroded, but there's no one really stepping up the defense of those principles. And that's what I think is necessary right now. So I don't think we can reclaim the open internet as it was once dreamt about, but I do think that there can be a concerted effort, a more serious effort on the part of democratic societies to make sure that governance leads to the protection of those freedoms and rights and not to state control and repression and so on and so forth. So sometimes for freedoms, you actually need government interventions, ironically enough.
Yeah, it sounds increasingly sort of utopian to be talking about free, open and secure, unfortunately.
Yes, sadly.
We've got a question from Ken Woods, and his question is, what is the most promising overlap between cyber policy and your Stanford work on human-centered artificial intelligence as enabler? Can human-centered artificial intelligence help sense-making, protect rights, and maintain trust in tech by emphasizing a humanistic approach?
Well, I hope so. I think it is a quest. And also much depends on how you see human-centered. For some people, human-centered means having a human in the loop, whereas if you've spent some time in coalition governments or policy making, you will appreciate the idea that a human may disagree from another human in terms of what is the proper approach. So just having this solution of a human in the loop, to me, doesn't reassure necessarily. I think it's much more about how design processes, engineering processes, governance processes, whether they are made by company engineers or democratic policymakers, are geared towards protecting some of those core values, those public interests, and by proxy, obviously, the safeguarding of human agency, the ability to know, the ability to scrutinize, the ability to choose. And these are all at stake when we look at the uses of artificial intelligence the power of artificial intelligence in steering us in certain consumer behavior, steering us towards certain information, knowing a lot about ourselves without us being aware of what the systems know. So I think it is really vital that we have a clear view of what we think processes should look like that are left to artificial intelligence, with all the unintended consequences that will lead to, and where we think it is appropriate to leave those new innovations to be used within a society, or where they should be tested and researched more before that is a safe moment to do so.
I was going to just jump in with one question myself, and this one's a little bit selfish, because you serve, as you mentioned, as on the Cyber Peace Institute as its president, and I should note I also very honoured to serve in a much lesser role on the advisory board. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why the Peace Institute was established and the focus of its work so far.
Well, thank you, and don't underestimate your own role as an advisory board member. We really benefit from expertise and a growing group of people that are willing to support our mission, which is to push back against the escalation of conflict in cyberspace in three main ways. One is to make this a story about what it means for people. We just talked about human-centered AI. I think we also need a human-centered understanding of cyber conflict and cyber attacks. Too often it's about which methodology might have been used, ransomware, how much money has been obtained by criminals, and so on. And we don't talk about the patients that couldn't go to the hospital, the human rights defenders that were intimidated, the disabling of critical infrastructure, the uncertainty that it leads to, the empty shelves in the supermarket that we saw here when a transport company was targeted by ransomware, and so on. And ransomware is one thing, but there's of course also conflicts between states that increasingly have a very, very aggressive component of cyber attacks. So looking at what that means for people is important. Putting out analysis of the methods used, the way in which these attacks are happening is another goal of the Cyber Peace Institute, to really put in the public domain for better understanding how these attacks work. Because very often knowledge about risks, knowledge about the types of attacks and the types of targets really stays either with cybersecurity companies or with intelligence services, but it doesn't really become public. Sometimes there's understandable sensitivities, but there's also uncertainty on the part of targets. What can they share? What can they not share? And this lack of information sharing is a problem in fighting back. And lastly, we focus on making sure that the whole space of international law, responsible behavior gets pushed on political agendas. And having spent 10 years in politics, I can assure you, if people don't feel that this is about them, if they think that cyber attacks are something abstract or something that they have no ability to call for improvements about because it's out of their hands, then it's going to be much harder to get the political will to do something. So it's the combination of those three factors that we are focusing on. And, I wish it wasn't so, but since we started about a year and a half ago, the urgency with so many attacks being reported, and really with the intensification of the use of technology for this type of crime and conflict, we feel that we really have our work carved out for us. It's very, very urgent that we push back.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd love to see the reach of the Peace Institute extend even more here in Australia as well. So thank you for that. I was just going to prevail on you for one final question, if that's okay. It's from Angela Meira, and Angela's asked, if disinformation targets the weak in particular, how can children be protected? Children are particularly vulnerable to disinformation and are often unable to distinguish false from real news. Working in schools across Europe, it's been found that children increasingly get their information online. So what can we do in that particular regard?
Well, I'm really, really grateful for the question, because I think the fact that tech companies are using their strategies to reach children ever more young so that they can be looped in is very challenging. So on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to restrictions for the use of technologies on the part of children, what kind of services can be offered, similar to how advertising for candy, for example, cannot be paired with cartoons in a number of countries, in the interest of health of children and not reaching their immature brains yet with these kinds of seductive messages. There are parental controls that may have some function. I have to say I'm not the expert here. I know that with rap music, sometimes parental warnings were a reason to actually look specifically there because it made it more attractive. And I think the reality is that a lot of children outsmart their parents in surfing the internet and avoiding restrictions, and that's a big challenge. So I see a role for rules. I see a role for civil society. I know a number of organizations from Common Sense Media that does sort of labeling of certain services in the interest of protecting children the same way that movies are labeled, but also Lie Detectors, another organization that's active in Europe, works with journalists in classrooms to help educate children about how easily disinformation can be shared and how deceptive it can be. So I think there's a sort of whole of society approach necessary that involves education, regulation, and more responsible behavior by the tech companies themselves.
Well, Marietje, we covered a huge amount of ground there. I just wanted to thank you so much for giving us your morning to join us for this conversation. It was such a rich discussion. I think we could have gone down any one of those answers into many other questions unfolding from that. But I just wanted to thank you so much for making yourself available to do this today. Thank everyone who has joined us online to participate, for sending in your questions and for engaging with each other through the platform. And we look forward to doing it again sometime, but just wanted to please join me virtually thanking you for the wonderful discussion. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for all the wonderful questions, and I can't wait to be able to visit Australia again in person. There are so many great things happening, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye.